So our modern periodic table is broken up into three general parts, and those parts are metals, nonmetals, and metalloids. About 80% of the periodic table is metals, and about maybe 15% of it is nonmetals, and about 5% represents the metalloids. So most of the periodic table that you see when you look at it are made of metals. Here's what we know about metals. They're in the left side of the periodic table and in the middle, and they represent, as I mentioned, about 80% of the elements. All of them are solid at room temperature, except for mercury, which is the only liquid metal at room temperature. They are known to be good conductors of heat and electricity, and they always produce positive ions, which means they always lose their electrons. Here's a picture of a periodic table, and in green, you'll see that most of the left and middle of the periodic table, including the rows on the bottom, are considered to be metals, about 80%. I'd like you to pause the video at this time, take out your periodic table, and find a colored pencil or a highlighter, and color in the metals. Pay close attention to the element in the upper left-hand corner. Hydrogen is not considered a metal. And pay close attention to the stair-step blue elements here, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, your periodic table also has elements all the way along the bottom here, all the way out to 118, and those are all metals as well. Now, the next largest group of elements are the nonmetals. They are located in the upper right-hand side of the periodic table. Don't forget about hydrogen. Now, these substances could be solids, liquids, or gases at room temperature. So they don't have a definite composition, could be solid, liquid, or gas. Now, because metals are so good at conducting electricity, nonmetals are known as poor conductors of electricity and heat. Things like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus are all poor conductors of heat and electricity. Now, the other thing that you need to know about them is they always produce negative ions, with the exception of hydrogen. Hydrogen is a nonmetal but behaves like a metal. We'll get to that. But all the other nonmetals in the right-hand side of the periodic table produce negative ions, or in other words, they gain electrons. So let's revisit our picture of the periodic table. Notice the nonmetals are over here in this little triangular portion. Take a moment and pause the video and color in your periodic table with a different color at this time. Keep in mind, don't forget about hydrogen up here. It is listed on the side with the metals, but it is in fact a nonmetal. Finally, the metalloids, which if you think about it, are kind of a hybrid between metals and nonmetals. They divide the metals and nonmetals on the periodic table using a kind of a diagonal line between them. What's unique about them is they share both traits of metals and nonmetals. That's what this means, metal and nonmetal. And to be honest, they're pretty rare. I will very seldomly use them as examples of elements in class. The most common example of a metalloid is silicon, which is used in computer chips and circuit boards. It's used because it's a solid, but a fairly decent conductor of heat and electricity, but is a solid, which is useful for things like computer chips, because nobody wants a liquid computer chip, let's be honest. So taking our last look at our periodic table, you'll recognize the metalloids as this blue diagonal line here with a couple of elements kind of below it, germanium and antimony. But boron, silicon, arsenic, tellurium, astatine, germanium, and antimony make up the metalloids. And with that, I'm going to end this video lesson for now. Thanks for listening.